Hello, viewers. I'd like to welcome you to this segment on social emotional needs of youth with challenging behaviors. Have you ever been in a situation where there was a whole lot of talk about a child and they said, that's a bad child? They talk about behavior, discipline. The child is put out of school. Well, let's talk about this. Hello, my name is Dr. Marla Crawford. I am a QMHP for children and adults. I currently have a degree in psychology, specializing in applied behavior analysis. My PhD is in special education leadership. In addition to those facets, I am certified by the Secretary of the Supreme Court in Restorative Justice, which is mediation. So let's talk about children with challenging behaviors in education and what that means and what that looks like. Challenging behaviors. What is it? How do we define challenging behavior? Well, according to Smith and Fox, challenging behavior is defined as repeated patterns that interferes with or is at risk of interfering with a child's ability to obtain optimal learning and engagement and pro-social interaction with peers and adults. That's a whole lot in one breath. So let me break it down for you. That simply means that the child has some social skills deficits that interferes with his or her ability to learn and to engage in a learning environment, which also may impede their ability to sustain themselves in an academic setting. There are elements to challenging behavior. There are environmental elements as well as psychological elements. The environmental elements can be things such as noises, like gaining access to something that they prefer or an activity that they may want to be involved in. So these are some environmental factors. The psychological factors to challenging behavior consist of feelings of being excluded, loneliness, being devalued, being labeled. And when I say labeled, sometimes when students are labeled as being bad, or they may be labeled according to what they look like or where they come from, it can create a psychological imbalance for them. Some psychological aspects to challenging behavior is also living up to the expectations of others. So, what do I mean by this? Sometimes when coming up, living up to expectations of others, it consists of doing what others want you to do or anticipate you will do. Some common challenging behaviors. We have common challenging behaviors of aggression, which may but not limited to hitting, kicking, and biting. We have self-injurious behaviors such as head-butting, biting oneself, or hitting oneself. Now, this area is very high risk and concerning, as with all areas, and we will talk a little bit about that later on. The other challenging behavior may consist of sexualized behavior in public, throwing items and breaking things, as well as soiling and smearing. In addition to the challenging behaviors that I've identified, there are other aspects of it which consist of being withdrawn. And we call these things such as being shy, rocking, staring, forms of anxiety. Some students actually have school phobia, truancy, social isolation, and flapping. Now, let me give you an example of this withdrawn behavior. In my younger years, in my early years of being an educator, I've always had the reputation of being very strict, very stern. And I can remember one day being a middle school teacher, and my expectations were so high of students, but I also expected them to do what was required of them, what was directed them to do. I had this student in my science class, and she had gone through all the process of having her science fair project approved. Everything was already laid out. Had already had everything as she needed it. The only thing she needed to do was to transfer her information to her science display board. She comes to class with a science fair board. Now, mind you, we're doing science fair projects. She's come to the classroom with a science fair board with something that had nothing to do with her topic that she had approved. It didn't look like nothing she had on her paper. Everything was already walked through. And come to find out, she grabbed a science display board from 2 years prior. being the person that I was back then, and of course, I've grown into my profession and grown into my character and who I am when it comes to education. But being who I was back then and how I engage academically, I just removed everything from the science fair board and I explained to her, this is not the project that you agreed. This is not what was approved. This is not what was in your paper. Well, the student got to a place where she did not want to come into my class, but she knew she had to. And she became very sickly. Every time she came to the classroom, she either had to leave because her stomach was hurting, her head was hurting. There were a couple of times she actually had gotten sick. And I didn't recognize what was going on because, there was no communication about it. And what it was, she became fearful of coming to my class. And after we got her to a place where her board was done, and she realized that she did not put the work on the board, she actually had told her parents she had done the display board and showed them the board, but she showed her parents something that had nothing to do with what was going on. It was another board for years past. And then after she did that, I kept her after school and as we began to talk, she shared with me how she was feeling. And I told her it was a safe space to talk to me. It was okay. And she told me that she didn't want to come to my class anymore because she wasn't passing the class or she wasn't going to pass the class because of the science fair project. I said, no, that's not the case. I said, let's work on this. So after a couple of evenings of working together one-on-one with her, getting the board together, and she presented the board and she won the state competition, her whole demeanor changed. But then what was happening, she was responding to not meeting my expectations. And some would say maybe because we took the stuff off the board so that she can correct her board. But once she got there to that place of success, she became very proud of who she was and what she was doing. As a matter of fact, she was the first one getting to class every day after that factor. Other challenging behavior is disruptive behavior. This can be such as getting out the seat, calling out in class, such as yelling across the classroom, throwing tantrums, swearing, refusing to follow instruction. These are common factors. Common behaviors in adolescence. Now, this is a unique space because we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, and some of the challenging behaviors leads to out of school suspension, where because the student has not been given proper supports and services. But teenagers also experience a lot of challenging behaviors just in general, even within their home life. And this could be in the form of defiance, being argumentative with parents, being disrespectful towards others in the family, fluency, fluctuations in fluency in their emotion, meaning that their emotions are not stable. One minute they're happy, the next minute they're not, or they may just look withdrawn, they may become moody. And sometimes we as parents or as educators, we wonder who is this person? Because this is not the child that we've always seen. So we talk about mood swings and things of that nature with teenagers and adolescents. Some of the common challenging behaviors that students experience in school consist of threats of physical violence, obvious intoxication, meaning that sometimes students come to school where they have been drinking, they have used drugs, but sometimes we can confuse what's going on, and we think they're intoxicated, and it may be drug related, but it may be from prescription medication. And I say this because the 30 some years I've had in education, I've seen students come and they look maybe like they may be spaced out, they may not be focused, they may have blurs in their voice and when they're talking. And sometimes it could just be the medication that has been prescribed for them that may be too strong. So when we look at intoxication, we need to really understand and dig a little deeper to find out exactly what it is before we look at it as a negative sense. But challenging behavior is anything that interferes. And I want you to understand that the challenging behavior does not have to be negative. It does not have to be negative. Sometimes the student may have psychological issues and needs that need to be met. There are moments of bouts of suicidal, homicidal behaviors or threats that some students experience. And to give you an example of that, I remember a case where a student was fine throughout the day. And at some point in time throughout the day, she drew a gun on her arm. And come to find out, she was being bullied. And so it became a challenging behavior. You have forms of sexual harassments that are common challenges of behaviors in school amongst children. And that can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be a gesture. Sometimes it just can be just providing a picture. And if it's unwanted and unaccepted, it can be a form of sexual harassment. There are causes of challenging behaviors. And I want you to understand this is not an exclusive list that I'm giving you. These are some examples that I'm providing you and some things that we really need to look at. One of the big causes is lack of needed social and emotional skills and self-regulation. That means that for me professionally, I call it a social skill deficit. That means that children tend to have behaviors and they may respond in feeling anxious, meaning that they may be overly responsive, they may be overwhelmed, they may be struggling in processing their feelings. They may have difficulties in giving adequate responses or acceptable responses. So they don't have that mean to actually articulate and respond in a manner for which we want. Sometimes it encompasses self-regulations, as I mentioned. And what happens with that is that they tend to not control how they respond and act. Some other common challenges or causes for challenging behavior consist of communication and language. If an individual is unable to communicate or possess the appropriate language, it can be frustrating, it can be difficult, it can be adverse towards the individual that is trying to communicate, as well as the individual that may be trying to receive and be receptive of the communication. So we have to look at that from both sides of the scales. It may be some needs for social attention as well as the working memory. For example, if a student is not remembering what taught or learned, it can be challenging and it can create certain types of behaviors, such as acting out when they're unable to grasp what they have learned. They may need to get attention and be attention seeking. So they may demonstrate certain behaviors just to seek attention or obtain something they want. They may have difficulties with their cognitive flexibility and social thinking. I like to call this tunnel vision or tunnel perception of how to engage. Sometimes it's just to escape and get away with what has happened or to remove themselves from it. For example, if an individual doesn't want to go to the lunchroom if they're in school, they may engage in some type of behavior just so they don't have to do something that they dislike. And it would be, believe it or not, sometimes challenging behavior can occur when there's good news. Have you ever been somewhere and you just shouted, "Wow," out of the blue? Can you imagine being in a library, which is a quiet space, and you receive an email on your computer and you get excited and you holler, "Yes!" That may disturb others in the library. And this can happen in any setting, even in a classroom setting. Meeting the needs of youth with challenging behaviors. So, how do we do that? The first thing we need to do when trying to meet the needs of youth with challenging behaviors, we need to do a proper and appropriate assessment. I'm going to mention a few assessments, but it's not exclusive list. But these are some that we use. In education, they used to use the Vinland Adaptive Behavior Checklist. You have the Connors Parent and Teacher Rating Scales. There is the Vanderbilt Assessment. You have, this is a very common one that they use mainly with children with autism in education. They use the Behavior Assessment System for children. You have the Achenbach Child Behavior Checklist. That's my favorite because it has assessments that are for the younger individual as well as to the mature and older individuals. So there's a wide range. And one of the other things that we use is functional behavior assessments. This is something that You find that it's a buzzword in education a lot, but it's good in all genres. I've actually had an opportunity to see it in action and work with it when it comes to someone in the military. In addition to this, it's common in education. It can be an extensive assessment. It can be very expensive as well to conduct because you're talking about hours and hours and hours between observations, evaluating records, interviewing parents, educators, and thus forth. Now, I want you to understand, I feel from a professional opinion, the most effective behavior assessment encompasses observation, self monitoring, the psychophysiology, self reporting, interviews, and direct supervision. I feel that those things need to take place. Do all of them need to be present to have an effective evaluation tool? No. But you certainly want to make sure there's observation, interviews. You want to make sure there is some type of monitoring and supervision. You want to make sure you have those. Again, make sure of all else you have observation, interviews. That's with the parent, the student, the caregiver, or anyone that has an interest in the child or the person. You want to make sure that you have some type of direct supervision where things can be monitored and looked at. So keep in mind, behavior assessments, there are a lot of tools out there, but there are some that I feel professionally are better than others. But make sure whatever it is we use when it comes to evaluating individuals with challenging behaviors have certain components to it. Meeting the needs of youth with challenging behaviors. This is something that I feel that a lot of school districts are met with challenges because of the allocation of resources. But there are many ways that this can take place in the academic setting as well as in a community based setting. Some of the things that we do is ABA supports and services, and that is not just for children or individuals with autism. ABA supports and service is good and appropriate for any individuals that may be experiencing some form of challenging behavior. It can be communication, it can be organization, it can be staying on task, it can be how to give the appropriate response, how to engage in an academic environment. So it can actually be how do you manage your day, time management. So I want you to understand ABA supports and services is not just for individuals with autism. They can receive, in the youth with challenging behavior can receive counseling, art therapy, exercise therapy. They can get support through social skill development, response to intervention, art, and we call it RTI in education. And RTI, one of the things that I found from a professional standpoint in engaging with school districts and being a career educator, the RTI programs doesn't seem to exist in its corrective form, or should I say the appropriate form. RTI should encompass a reading intervention component. There should be some type of counseling or social skill development, and there must be continuous data collection through that process. Now, one of the things that I recommend in addition to that, if the school district is open to or is able to put some math remediation in there with the reading intervention. But this is something to, when we do RTI, we use it as an early intervention process to try to address the challenging behaviors and the gaps that may exist academically. Because sometimes when students don't know something or they struggle academically, they act out. So we like to put that in place before we start evaluating them to rule out a suspected disability. And keep in mind, I said rule out a suspected disability. We look at differentiated instruction to try to address the challenging behavior because some students learn differently. Some students are auditory learners, some students are kinesthetic learners, some students are tactile learners. So we have to look at how we are educating the children because that plays a role in the behavior as well. We look at community-based instruction as a means to meeting their needs. And I would like to say community-based instruction is not simply sending a child or taking a child to the store and showing them how to pay for something and get change. We're talking about how to engage when they come in contact with individuals and authorities, when they go to certain places, how to engage in crowds of individuals, how to just sustain themselves within a community and in that setting. We use technology integration. Sometimes technology to deal with challenging behavior can help individuals to communicate as well to navigate amongst their current environment, whether it's in the actual home community, the school community, it can actually be in a facility. So we have to look at what the needs. Also, one of the most important things I'm concerned about too, sometimes our children are placed in an academic setting that's not appropriate for them. We have public day school settings, which is the public schools, but sometimes we need private day, which is a private school setting. Sometimes there's a need for specialized schooling, such as lab schools, charter schools, Montessori schools. We have to look at what is going to meet the needs of the individual. And the one thing I can tell you, I can remember reading the writings of Neil Noddings. And Neil Noddings talked about educating children based on their interests. Sure, you give them the fundamentals of the reading, writing, mathematics, and all of that. But when a child is learning in their area of interest, it becomes an intrinsic motivational factor, and you tend to get the best outcome or the optimal learning experience because of the level of engagement and interest. Sometimes we need to also develop an IFSP. That's an individualized family service plan. We do that a lot for preschoolers and early childhood, but that can happen with any age group student because sometimes and more than often, the behavior transitions from home to school, from school to home. And I'm a strong supporter of what we're doing in the academic setting to meet the challenging behavior of students should parallel or coincide with what's going on at home because we want the training and the teaching to be generalized. And when I say generalized, that means that child's able to engage and act accordingly in different settings and not just in one. Sometimes we develop an IEP, which is an individualized educational program. And of course, we connect that with special education supports and services when the student has been identified as having a disability. We have 504 plans. Sometimes students do not have an actual need to receive support and services through special education because they may not have met the criteria or met that tier that requires that. And that varies from state to state. Different states have different criteria for when a child can be found eligible for special education supports and services. But through the 504 plan, we can provide accommodations that would meet their needs, not only if it's a medical need, but sometimes the need may be psychological, it may be to adapt in an environment, such as some students can't test in a large group setting. Does that mean that we cannot make accommodations for them? Sometimes the 504 plan, the student may have to be in and out of school for different reasons. So we look at accommodations. And one of the pet peeves that I have is vocational education programs. One of the things that concerns me is that some states, such as Virginia, don't provide a vocational education diploma anymore, where we know that trade is a sustainable way of life, but it also provides a hands-on experiences and is something meaningful for learners. And a lot of times we want all students to say, "Oh, you're going to get this standard diploma or this advanced diploma." I think we do a disservice when students aren't able to achieve that goal when they need a vocational program. One of the things that I want to tell you about when it comes to educating children, the Supreme Court of the United States spoke it well. I want you to think about this question as I say it. And I'm referencing this to the Supreme Court of the United States. What is the level of educational benefits that a school must confer with a child with a disability and that to provide them a free, appropriate public education guaranteed by the Individuals with Disability Act, IDA? What that question, that's a lot of question, right? So just to break that question down, basically what the question is, what are the educational benefits that the school districts must provide for students so in order to provide faith. And they addressed this under IDEA because there was a case that was Andrew versus Douglas County School District. And what the Supreme Court said, and it was clear, it says school districts must offer children with individualized educational programs, and that's an IEP, that is reasonably calculated, enable each child. Keep in mind, it says they must provide the child with an IEP that is reasonably calculated and enables the child to make progress. That's the education level that the Supreme Court said that must be provided. This opinion was delivered by Chief Justice John Roberts Jr., and he is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Again, they said school districts must offer children an educational plan or IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate for the child's circumstance. Chief Justice Judge Roberts rendered that opinion, and the opinion was unanimous. And this was done March the 22nd of 2017. And I want to say this, even though it was done in reference to a child, a special education child, or a child that has an IEP, this is really applicable to all students. Every student is entitled to a free, appropriate education, and they must make progress. That's how, because education is not set on just a flat field. It's not just flat. It's a spiraling curriculum that we teach our children. So every year in school, the curriculum builds on the prior learning experience. And if the student has not learned or obtained or retained that level of learning, then when they go to the next level, they are behind. So the student must make a progress. And even though their ruling again was in reference to IDEA with a child that has an IEP, it's also applicable to all students. So don't think that it is limited. It's not. So when we look at the laws and the case law concerning special education, look and see how they can apply to general ed students as well, because we have some students that may not meet the threshold to receive special education supports and service. And a lot of times these students fall through the crack or in the gray areas. Thank you for joining me. And this has been Dr. Marla Faith Crawford. And I look forward to seeing your responses and responding to some of your questions.